The emergency message reached Earth at 3 in the morning. Admiral Kate woke up to the sound of her communication device screaming with urgent alerts. She had served in the United Earth Fleet for 30 years and had commanded it for the last 12. She had seen wars and she had seen peace, but nothing in her long career had prepared her for the words that appeared on her screen that night. The Galactic Council had voted. The decision was unanimous. Every single member species had agreed to something called Protocol 17. The protocol was simple in its horror. Every human colony outside the solar system would be destroyed within 72 hours. Every man, woman, and child living on those distant worlds would die. The reason the Council gave was that humanity had grown too fast, too strong, and too dangerous to be allowed to continue spreading across the stars. Kate rushed to the command center of the orbital station called Sentinel. This massive structure floated above Earth and served as the headquarters for all human military operations in space. When she arrived, her officers were already there. Their faces were pale and their hands were shaking as they worked at their stations. Nobody could believe what was happening. Commander Jack Palmer was her second in command. He was a good man who had served beside her for many years. He pulled up a holographic display that showed the locations of all human colonies spread across the galaxy. As Kate watched, red markers began appearing one by one. Each red marker meant that a colony had gone silent. Each red marker meant that millions of humans had just died. New Horizon was the first to fall. It was a beautiful world with blue oceans and green forests where 300 million people had built their homes. Thence hope went dark. The colony had been famous for its universities and its scientists who studied the mysteries of the universe. Then the settlement on Centauri disappeared from the map. Kate felt her heart break because her own daughter had helped build that colony. Her daughter had sent her pictures just last week, showing the new gardens they had planted. Kate asked Jack how many people would die if the Council completed their operation. Jack checked the numbers and his voice cracked when he answered. If every colony outside the solar system was destroyed, 14 billion human beings would be killed. 14 billion innocent people who had done nothing wrong except belong to a species that the galaxy had decided was too successful. For 100 years, humanity had believed that the alien species of the galaxy were their friends. The Galactic Council had welcomed humans when they first ventured beyond their own solar system. They with their beautiful crystalline bodies had shared their knowledge of energy systems. They with their many arms and their connected minds had helped humans build better spacecraft. The ancient who claimed to have guided countless civilizations had offered wisdom and guidance. Humans had trusted them. Humans had worked beside them and traded with them and signed treaties with them. Human children had grown up learning alien languages and dreaming of visiting alien worlds. Human diplomats had spent their careers building friendships across species lines. And now those same friends had decided that humanity needed to be cut down like weeds in a garden. Kate stood very still for a long moment. Around her, the command center buzzed with frantic activity. Officers were trying to contact colonies that no longer answered. Others were calculating how long until Council warships reached the remaining human settlements. Everyone was afraid and everyone was looking to her for guidance. She thought about her daughter. She thought about the billions of humans who were dying right now while she stood here. She thought about the 100 years of trust that had just been shattered like glass. And then she thought about something else. She thought about a secret that only a handful of humans knew. A secret that had been kept for 80 years, passed down from one generation of leaders to the next. Humanity had never fully trusted the galaxy. Even while smiling at diplomatic functions and signing agreements, a small group of humans had been for the worst. They had built ships in hidden places. They had trained soldiers in secret facilities. They had studied every alien species and learned their weaknesses. They had hoped this preparation would never be needed, but they had made sure it existed just in case. Kate walked slowly to the primary communications console. This equipment could send a message to every human vessel and every human station across the galaxy. It could reach places that the Council did not even know existed. Her fingers touched the controls and she took a deep breath. Jack Palmer watched her with wide eyes. He did not know about the secret preparations. Almost nobody did, but he could see something in his admiral's face that he had never seen before. It was not fear, it was not despair, it was something cold and hard and absolutely certain. Kate thought about what message to send. The Council had spent a century studying humanity. They had watched how humans reacted to challenges. They had analyzed human psychology and they believed they knew exactly what humanity would do when faced with extinction. They expected panic and chaos and desperate pleas for mercy. They were wronged. Kate opened the channel. The signal went out across encrypted frequencies that the Council had never detected. It reached hidden bases and secret fleets and soldiers who had spent their whole lives waiting for this moment. It reached every corner of human civilization, both the parts the galaxy knew about and the parts it did not. She spoke only one word. Retaliator. The word echoed across the stars. It was heard by captains who had trained in shadows and admirals who commanded ships that officially did not exist. It was heard by soldiers who had sworn oaths to defend humanity no matter the cost. It was heard by engineers and scientists who had spent decades building weapons that the galaxy could not imagine. Kate did not cry for her daughter that night. She did not beg the council for mercy. She did not waste time with anger or grief or despair. She simply gave an order and trusted that her people would carry it out. The galaxy had made a terrible mistake. They had assumed that humanity was soft because humans smiled easily and made friends quickly and preferred peace to war. They had forgotten that the same species which built hospitals also built weapons. The same species which wrote poetry also wrote battle plans. The same species which dreamed of peace also prepared for war. The council wanted to know how humanity would respond to betrayal. Now they would find out, and they would learn that some words carry more weight than entire speeches. Some words change the course of history. Some words start wars that reshape the universe. Kate had spoken such a word, and nothing would ever be the same again. For 80 years, humanity had been building in secret, while politicians shook hands with alien ambassadors, while scientists shared their discoveries at galactic conferences, while ordinary people lived their lives believing that the universe was a friendly place. A shadow had been running beneath the surface of human civilization. It was called Project, and fewer than 1,000 people in the entire human species knew that it existed. Captain Danny Webb stood on the bridge of his ship and watched the stars through the main viewing window. His vessel was called the Defiance, and it was a dreadnought, one of the largest and most powerful warships ever built by human hands. But the Defiance was not alone. All around it, emerging from hidden bases carved into asteroids and moons and abandoned planets, hundreds of other ships were appearing. 300 capital ships, 1,800 support vessels, crews that had trained for decades in complete secrecy, weapons that combined the best human technology with alien systems that had been studied and improved in ways the Council could not imagine. This was the fleet, and Danny Webb was one of its commanders. Lieutenant Maria Santos sat at her station on the bridge, checking the status reports that flowed in from every ship in the fleet. She was young, but she was brilliant, and she had given up a normal life to serve in a military that officially did not exist. She reported to Danny that all ships were battle-ready. The fleet was his to command. Danny had spent 20 years for this day. He had trained crews in facilities hidden so deep in empty space that no alien sensor could find them. He had run thousands of simulations, planning for wars against every possible enemy. He had studied the Council species in ways they never suspected, learning their weaknesses and their blind spots and their arrogance. The aliens had made a critical mistake. They had assumed that humans were like them, that human governments were transparent and human secrets were easily discovered. They had never understood that humans had a long history of hiding things, of planning for disasters, of for the worst while hoping for the best. Human governments had kept secrets from each other for centuries. Keeping secrets from aliens was even easier. Danny ordered his communications officer to open a channel to Admiral. A moment later, Kate's face appeared on the main screen. She was still at Sentinel Station, surrounded by the chaos of Earth's official forces trying to respond to the crisis. But her eyes were calm and her voice was steady. Danny reported that the fleet was active and awaiting orders. 342 capital ships, 1,800 support vessels, full combat capability. The secret weapon that humanity had prayed would never be needed was now ready to fight. Kate allowed herself a small smile. She told Danny that the Council was broadcasting their attack across all frequencies. They wanted every species in the galaxy to see humanity being destroyed. They wanted to make an example of the young species that had grown too quickly. Danny said that if the Council wanted a show, humanity would give them one, just not the show they expected. The battle plan had been refined over decades. Every Council species had weaknesses that they believed were hidden. Though with their crystalline bodies were beautiful and strong, but certain sound frequencies could shatter them like glass. They were powerful because their minds were all connected, but if you disrupted their communication systems, billions of workers would suddenly find themselves unable to receive orders. The Ancient had lived so long in comfort and safety that they had forgotten what it meant to face a real threat. Danny turned to face his crew. These men and women had sacrificed everything to serve in this fleet. They had left behind families and friends and careers. They had lived in secrecy, unable to tell anyone what they really did. They had maintained readiness for a war they hoped would never come. Now it had come, and they were ready. Danny gave the order to set course for the enemy had struck first and killed billions of innocent humans. Now it was time to introduce the galaxy to the real power of humanity. The fleet moved as one, hundreds of ships accelerating toward their targets. In the empty spaces between stars, other elements of the fleet were also moving. Attack groups heading toward communication stations, assault teams to strike military bases, specialized units targeting the supply lines that kept the Council's war machine running. Maria Santos watched the tactical display as human ships spread across the galaxy like a wave. She had joined Project when she was barely out of school, recruited by officers who saw her potential. She had wondered sometimes if all her training would be wasted, if she would spend her whole life for a fight that never happened. Now she knew that every hour of training, every simulation, every sacrifice had been worth it. The Council had decided to murder humanity. They had started their attack believing that their victims could not fight back. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Danny Webb sat in his command chair and watched the stars blur as his fleet entered the light travel. He thought about the colonies that had already been destroyed, the billions of humans who had died in the first hours of this war. He thought about the children who would never grow up and the families that had been torn apart. He was not a man who enjoyed violence. None of the commanders were. They had trained for war because they understood that sometimes war was necessary to protect the innocent. They had hoped that their deterrent would never need to be used, but the Council had forced their hand. There was 12 hours away at maximum speed, 12 hours until the first major counterstrike of the war, 12 hours until the galaxy learned that humanity was not a victim to be slaughtered, but a force to be reckoned with. Danny ordered his crew to rest in shifts. They would need their strength for what was coming. The battle for human survival had begun and there was no room for error. Somewhere in the depths of space, the Council commanders were celebrating their easy victory over the young human species. They had no idea what was coming for them. They had no idea that the prey they thought they were hunting had been watching them for decades, learning their secrets for exactly this moment. The fleet flew on through the darkness between stars, carrying the fury of a species that refused to die. The Council species had prepared for resistance. They had expected that humans might try to fight back with whatever small forces they had available. They had positioned their fleets to crush any desperate counterattack. They had written speeches to be delivered after humanity's final defeat, explaining to the galaxy why this purge had been necessary. They had not prepared for what actually happened. Within 48 hours, the fleet struck 12 major targets across Council space. The attacks came without warning, appearing out of nowhere with weapons and tactics that the aliens had never seen before. Military stations that had stood for thousands of years were reduced to floating debris in minutes. Supply lines that stretched across dozens of star systems were cut in coordinated strikes. Communication networks that connected billions of minds went dark. On a planet of crystal spires and shimmering cities, Ambassador Hayes walked through the streets of the capital with human marines at her side. She wore a simple diplomatic uniform, but the soldiers around her were in full combat armor, carrying weapons that with deadly energy. Had spent 30 years building relationships with the people. She had learned their language until she could speak it perfectly. She had studied their culture until she understood their hopes and fears and dreams. She had believed that friendship between species was possible, that the galaxy could be a place of cooperation and mutual respect. They had repaid her dedication by voting to exterminate her species. Now she walked through their capital as a conqueror. Above the beautiful crystal towers, human warships hung in the sky like angry stars. The military had been destroyed in 6 hours. Their stations were gone. Their warships were floating wreckage. Their ground forces had surrendered when they realized that resistance meant total destruction. High Crystalline was the leader of the people. He was an ancient being, his crystalline body patterned with the of centuries of experience. He had served on the Council for longer than humans had possessed technology. He had voted for Protocol 17 because he believed that young species needed to be controlled before they became dangerous. Now he stood before Hayes in the great chamber where leaders had ruled for 10,000 years. His body flickered with patterns of fear and confusion as he tried to understand what was happening. He told that she could not do this. He said that there were members of the Council. He said there were treaties and rules and protocols. His voice was desperate and his light patterns showed his terror. Looked at him with eyes that held no mercy. She reminded him of Protocol 17. She asked him if that was what the Council called it when they voted to murder an entire species. She asked him if there were treaties protecting the 14 billion humans who had died in the first hours of the attack. Tried to explain. He said that humanity was different. He said that humans were a threat to galactic stability. He said that the Council had no choice but to act before it was too late. Stepped closer to the alien leader. She told him that humans had been allies to them for a century. Humans had shared their art and music and science. Humans had helped terraform 3 worlds for when their population grew too large for their. Humans had treated them as friends. and the had voted to murder human children. Outside the chamber, the sky burned with the light of human weapons, but explained that the humans were not attacking civilians, they were not destroying cultural sites or historical monuments, they were simply removing every military asset they possessed, they were making sure they could never threaten humanity again. Asked what the humans wanted, his voice was small now, all his ancient dignity stripped away by fear. Told him that humans wanted accountability. Every species that had voted for Protocol 17 would answer for that decision, not with genocide because humans were not like the Council, but with consequences. The economy would be placed under human supervision, their military would be reduced to only what was needed for, their seat on the Council would be suspended for 100 years, they would pay reparations to the families of the humans they had killed. Similar scenes were happening across Council space at the same time. On Earth, billions of workers stood frozen and confused because their communication network had been destroyed. There were a species of connected minds, each individual receiving instructions from Central Command. Without that connection, they did not know what to do. Human forces had taken control of their entire civilization without firing a single shot at civilians. Those ancient beings who claimed to have guided countless species to enlightenment found themselves facing a choice. Human ships surrounded their sacred archives, the collected knowledge of 1,000,000 years of history. They could fight and lose everything they valued, or they could surrender and face for their crimes. They chose to surrender. Their wisdom had taught them many things, but it had not prepared them for a species that could strike so fast and so hard that there was no time to react. Across the galaxy, the Council's power crumbled. Species that had believed themselves invincible discovered that their strength had been an illusion. They had grown comfortable over millennia of unchallenged rule. They had forgotten what it meant to face an enemy that was truly prepared to fight. Admiral watched the reports come in from across the war zone. Human casualties were remarkably low because the enemy had been caught completely off guard. The secret preparations of Project had worked exactly as planned. But the war was not yet over. The Council still existed, and its remaining members were gathering to respond. The next phase would be even more important than the military victories. Hayes looked at the defeated leader and told him that humanity was just getting started. The galaxy had tried to murder her people. Now her people would make sure nothing like this could ever happen again. The reckoning had begun, and every species in the Council would face it. Admiral Kate traveled to the heart of Council space. Her destination was a massive station that orbited a dead star, a neutron star that spun and pulsed with ancient radiation. This station was where the Galactic Council held its meetings and made its decisions. For thousands of years, the elder races had gathered here to discuss the fate of younger species. They had decided which civilizations would be allowed to grow and which would be quietly eliminated. Kate brought only a small escort of ships with her. She did not need a large fleet because the message she carried was more powerful than any weapon. She was here to reveal a truth that would change the galaxy forever. The Council members gathered in the Great Hall of the station. This room was designed to impress and intimidate visitors. The ceiling stretched so high that it seemed to disappear into darkness. The walls were carved with the symbols of 100 species that had once been great, but had long since faded into history. The floor was made of stone brought from the planets in the galaxy. Hundreds of alien delegates watched as Kate walked to the central podium. Some of them hated her because she represented the species that had just humiliated their militaries. Others were afraid because they did not know what humanity might do next. A few were curious because they had never seen a human stand where she now stood. Kate looked out at the assembled aliens and began to speak. She told them that they were probably wondering why humanity had not destroyed them completely. They had seen what the fleet could do. They knew that humans had the power to reduce their civilizations to rubble. The answer, Kate said, was simple. Humanity was not like the Council. She activated a holographic display that floated above the podium. Images began to appear, documents and recordings and evidence that human intelligence agents had gathered over many decades. The Council members watched in growing discomfort as their secrets were exposed. Kate explained that Protocol 17 was not created because humanity had grown too dangerous. The protocol had existed for 200 years before humans even learned how to travel between stars. It was the Council's standard procedure for dealing with any species that developed too quickly or became too powerful without asking permission first. The people of Sigma Draconis. Kate listed the names of 17 species that the Council had destroyed in the past 1,000 years. 17 entire civilizations that had been quietly eliminated because the elder races decided they were threats to galactic stability. Nobody had ever questioned these decisions because nobody knew about them. The Council controlled information across the galaxy. They decided what history was taught and what stories were told. They had erased entire species from memory and convinced everyone that this was normal and necessary. Silence filled the Great Hall as the evidence continued to appear. Kate showed recordings of council meetings where leaders casually discussed which species should be allowed to live and which should die. She showed documents that revealed how the council identified potential threats and planned their elimination decades in advance. She showed proof that humanity had been on the extermination list before they even built their first starship. Kate looked at the beings who had lived for centuries, who had watched civilizations rise and fall, who had convinced themselves that their casual genocide was somehow enlightened leadership. They had believed they were guiding the galaxy toward a better future. In truth, they were simply afraid of anyone who might one day challenge their power. She told them that humanity did not come here to conquer them. Humans had come to do something worse. They had come to tell the truth. This evidence was being broadcast to every inhabited world in the galaxy at this very moment. Every species that lived under council protection would learn what their protectors had done and what their protectors planned to do to anyone who grew too successful. Every civilization that had trusted the elder races would now know that trust had been misplaced. The implications spread through the assembly like ripples in water. Delegates from dozens of species looked at each other with new eyes. They had always believed that the Council existed to help younger civilizations develop and prosper. Now they understood that the Council existed to keep those civilizations weak and controllable. Kate watched as alliances that had lasted for millennia began to crack. Species that had been loyal Council supporters suddenly wondered if they were next on the elimination list. Others remembered friends and trading partners who had mysteriously disappeared from the galactic stage, their planets empty and their people gone. They had been told that those species had destroyed themselves or moved away or simply chosen to isolate from the rest of the galaxy. Now they knew the truth. An ambassador from a small species called the stood up from his seat. His people had been members of the Council for 500 years, always obedient and always grateful for the protection they received. He asked Kate if humanity had evidence about what happened to the sister species, who had vanished 3 centuries ago. Kate checked her data and found the answer. They had been eliminated under Protocol 8 because their scientists had developed a new form of energy generation that the Council considered too advanced for a species of their age. The ambassador sat down heavily in his seat. His people had spent 300 years wondering what happened to their closest friends. The Council had told them they had left the galaxy to explore distant regions of space. They had believed this lie and had mourned their friends and had trusted the Council to protect them from the same fate. Kate let the silence stretch. She wanted every being in that hall to understand what they were part of. She wanted them to feel the weight of the crimes that had been committed in their names. Then she spoke again. Humanity was not going to force anyone to do anything. Humans had revealed the truth, and now every species in the galaxy would have to decide what to do with that knowledge. They could continue to support the Council and hope they were never deemed too dangerous, or they could demand change. Kate walked out of the Great Hall with her head held high. Behind her, the galaxy was changing forever. 1 year had passed since the Council betrayed humanity. In that year, the galaxy had changed more than it had in the previous 10,000 years. The Galactic Council still existed, but it was not the same institution that had ruled unchallenged for so long. 12 species had withdrawn from the alliance completely, forming new independent coalitions that refused to answer to the elder races. Dozens more demanded reforms and transparency and oversight. The comfortable assumption that the ancient species knew best had been shattered and could never be put back together. Admiral Kate retired from military service. She was tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. She had spent her life serving humanity, and now she wanted to help rebuild what had been lost. She moved to the planet that had once been called New Horizon, the first colony destroyed in the initial attack. Human settlers were returning to rebuild their homes, and Kate wanted to be part of that healing. Her daughter had died on Centauri in the first hours of the war. Kate never forgot that loss, but she chose to her daughter's memory by helping other families find hope again. She spent her remaining years working with the children of New Horizon, teaching them about the stars and about the sacrifices that had been made to keep humanity alive. Captain Danny Webb became something he never expected to be. He was asked to command a new joint military force, one that included humans and aliens working together as equals. Species that had been victimized by Council policies for centuries wanted to learn from humanity. They wanted to understand how a young civilization had faced down ancient empires and survived. Danny trained officers from a dozen different worlds. He taught them the tactics that the fleet had used, and he taught them something more important. He taught them that no species had the right to decide which other species should live or die. He taught them that strength came from cooperation, not from domination. Ambassador Hayes was elected as the first human representative to a new organization called the Interstellar Assembly. This body replaced the old council structure with something designed to be fair to all species, young and old alike. There were no secret protocols for eliminating civilizations. There were no hidden agendas. Every decision was made openly and every member had an equal voice. Spent decades building the relationships that should have existed from the beginning. She worked with former enemies to heal old wounds. She helped write new laws that protected developing species from exploitation. She proved that diplomacy based on honesty was stronger than diplomacy based on lies. The fleet was no longer a secret. Its ships were integrated into the official human military, and their existence served as a permanent reminder. Humanity would never again be caught unprepared. The galaxy would never again assume that humans could be easily destroyed. But the changes that mattered most were happening in places far from Earth. On distant worlds across the galaxy, young species looked at what humanity had accomplished and felt something they had never felt before. They felt hope. For thousands of years, the Council had controlled their development and limited their ambitions. They had been told that the elder races knew what was best and that younger civilizations should be grateful for any freedom they were given. Now they knew the truth. The elder races were not wise guardians. They were afraid tyrants who destroyed anyone who might challenge their power, and they had been beaten by a species that was barely 3 centuries old in terms of space travel. Though that small species whose friends had been murdered 300 years earlier began a new relationship with humanity. They shared technology and trade and something even more valuable. They shared the belief that the galaxy could be better than it had been. Other species followed, the who had been on the Council's elimination list for showing too much military potential, the whose scientists had been forced to hide their best discoveries for fear of being deemed too advanced, the who had spent centuries pretending to be less capable than they really were. These species and many others formed new alliances based on mutual respect rather than fear. They created trading networks that bypassed the old council systems. They established research partnerships that shared knowledge freely instead of hoarding it for advantage. The and the still existed, but their power was greatly reduced. They faced the consequences of their crimes. Their economies struggled under reparation payments. Their militaries were limited to defensive forces only. Their voices in galactic affairs carried much less weight than before. Some of them accepted their punishment with dignity and worked to become better members of the galactic community. Others resented humanity and dreamed of revenge. But they had all learned that attempting to destroy humans was a mistake that led only to disaster. In the diplomatic archives of a dozen civilizations, the human response to Protocol 17 was recorded and studied carefully. Future historians would spend centuries analyzing what had happened. They would debate the ethics of the fleet and the tactics used in the war. They would argue about whether humanity had been too harsh or not harsh enough in their response. But they would all agree on one thing: when faced with extinction, humanity had not for mercy. They had not surrendered. They had not tried to negotiate with beings who had already decided to murder them. Instead, they had fought back with everything they had, and they had won. The order that started it all became famous across the galaxy. It was taught in military academies and diplomatic schools. It was carved into monuments and written into songs. It was a single word that showed exactly what humanity was capable of when pushed too far. Retaliator. Not with blind anger that destroyed everything in its path, not with cruelty that made humans no better than their enemies, but with cold, calculated, devastating effectiveness that made one thing absolutely clear: humanity would not go quietly into the dark. Humanity would not accept destruction as their fate. Humanity would fight and they would win, and anyone who tried to destroy them would regret it. The galaxy was a different place now. It was not perfect, and it never would be. There were still conflicts and disagreements and species who disliked each other, but there was also a new understanding that had not existed before. Every civilization had the right to exist. Every species had the right to grow and develop without fear of being eliminated by those who claimed to be their superiors. These ideas seemed obvious, but they had not been obvious to the Council for thousands of years. Humanity had taught the galaxy these lessons with fire and steel and blood. It was not the method that humans would have chosen, but it was the method that circumstances had forced upon them. And in the end, the result was a universe where young species could dream of the stars without fear. Kate died peacefully on New Horizon, surrounded by the children she had helped raise. Danny Webb eventually retired to a quiet world where he spent his days fishing in alien oceans. Hayes served in the Interstellar Assembly until she was very old, always fighting for justice and fairness. They were remembered as heroes who had saved humanity from destruction. But they would have said they were just doing what needed to be done. They would have said that any human would have done the same. Perhaps that was the real lesson of the war. Humanity was not special because of their technology or their tactics. Humanity was special because they refused to give up. They refused to accept that the powerful had the right to crush the weak. They refused to believe that the universe was a place where genocide was acceptable. And in the end, that refusal changed everything.